Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network. It is March 25th, 2019. Incidentally, I became a mother 36 years ago today, so it's a really special day for me. The 18th of Adar, the second month of Adar, 5779. I'm speaking kind of low because I'm having a good cup of coffee, which is the first one I've had all week. I'm in Washington, D.C. at AIPAC. More about that, I guess, in a later show. And I probably shouldn't have had coffee because I was still upset leaving a panel with Oded Ravivi, who was my show that you heard, the podcast, a few days ago. And the leftist that he was up against and the stuff that they were saying, I was just like flipping. He did really, really well. We'd be very proud of him. And our Yesha event last night was also great. I co-hosted with Yishai. It's online somewhere, and I can send you guys links or whatever. But it went really well. And so I'm very happy about that. But now I'm sitting and having a delicious cup of coffee, as I said, with Eric Rozenman. Eric has a lot to say, and I'm going to let him say it. I re-met him because I think I'd met him before a couple months ago. You guys remember I was in the States for camera for the media watchdog organization, and he came to hear me speak, and we reconnected, and he just put out a book, an excellent book, which I'm going to recommend to you guys right now at the beginning of the show. We're going to get that over with. Jews Make the Best Demons, Palestine and the Jewish Question, Eric Rozenman. I will talk about a little bit about the book, among other things now. But he's been writing for a long time, and I've been following him. So first of all, it was really great just to meet him, and thank you for this cup of coffee, because the coffee at AIPAC is just awful. So anyhow, Eric, thank you so much for joining me here today. You weren't at AIPAC, and you came in specially for the interview, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Eve, and thank you for the opportunity of being on your program. I think what I'd like to do first is talk about the title and explain the title. And the first part, Jews Make the Best Demons, is a close paraphrase of an observation by Winston Churchill in the 1920s, as related by his biographer Martin Gilbert. So Churchill made a short tour of Palestine in 1921, I think it was, and he was speaking with Palestinian Arab leaders, trying to encourage them to cooperate with the Zionists. And he said, look, the Zionists are building electric power plants, they're irrigating the soil, they're draining swamps, and it benefits you as well as it benefits them, and you should work with them. And he met utter rejection in this effort. And Gilbert says that Churchill concluded later that for the Arabs, the Jews, no matter what good work they might be doing in the short run, the Jews made the best demons for whatever reason. Well, we know historically that from the Middle Ages on, and even earlier, Jews made the best demons literally in Europe. In early Christianity, the medieval church saw them as in league with the devil. They were demonic. And it turns out that idea, of course, never died. And the idea of Jewish demons trying to control Christendom through the devil or with the devil simply was revived in the industrial age, in the post-Enlightenment era, with in the protocols. In the protocols of the Elders of Zion, you have a worldwide Jewish conspiracy with the forces of evil. Now they're secular forces of evil. It's capitalism, it's communism, whatever worked, but it was still the Jews as outside and having outsized power for being such a small and otherwise vulnerable group. They had some assistance. First the devil, now the various isms that they were supposedly manipulating. So Jews make the best demons.
That couldn't have been an easy title, though, for you to put down, because somebody may look at that and go, yeah, like they're actually thinking that you're promoting that idea.
The publisher and I went back and forth over a couple of title choices just because of that. And that's one reason that the subtitle is Palestine and the Jewish Question, Palestine in quotes. So if somebody takes a good look at the book cover and starts out by thinking, yes, I agree with that, the Jews are demonic, but wait a minute, what's this business about Palestine and Palestine in quotes and the Jewish Question? Well, the answer that I give in the book, and then I try to...
Spoiler alert.
that I try to demonstrate is that if in medieval Christianity Jews were the Christ killer, and that was the worst thing you could say, that was an indictment that led right to massacres, in today's secular fundamentalist mindset, which is every bit as rigid as the medieval church when it comes to the Jews, then what's the worst thing you can say? The worst thing you can say is racist. If you are racist, you're labeled, smeared. Not that there is not something really called racism, but if you are unfairly smeared as racist, there's no appeal. It's like the Inquisition. It's only a question of, are you going to be burned at the stake or drawn and quartered? Well, after Zionism is racism, 1975 UN resolution, then Israel, the Jewish state, became officially designated, tarred as they say, the Jew among nations. So the main thing that happened, and this is what I try to get at with the title, in the changing eras from medieval to modernity, in terms of a fundamental default position on how a significant part of the population in the West would think about the Jews, if they thought about the Jews at all, would be a negative. And why? Because the Jews stood outside the rest of humanity, and this is then what the Nazis were able to play on very well, and then not much behind them, the communists, the Bolsheviks. The Jews, that little stubborn, stiff-necked nationality, outsized influence and outsized power for their numbers, they must have some secret. If they weren't in league with the devil, then they were pulling some other lever. And the UN clarified that. They were pulling the racist imperialist lever, which is simply old Marxist categories brought forward. And it wasn't an accident that that resolution came from the Soviet Union and was adopted by the Arab League, not the other way around.
You're talking about Zionism as racism.
Yes. So Jews, in my opinion, took the wrong message from 1948 and 1967. 1948, Israel's established. Jews who might have been on the fence become, in diaspora and including the United States, become more openly pro-Zionist, pro-Israel. And after 67, definitely so. But I think drawing the wrong conclusions in that anti-Semitism was only discredited by the Nazi visible excesses for a generation or a generation and a half. The generation that fought the Nazis, they may not have had any special, they weren't philo-Semitic necessarily, but people who hated Jews and hated Israel sounded like the Nazis, so they were the bad guys until we had generational turnover. And after 67, this was my generation, the baby boomer generation coming of age just at that glorious moment when David defeats Goliath. Well, we imagined that solidified not only Israel's status, but our status as American Jews. I remember very clearly within a week of the Six-Day War, the same people who used to tell me jokes, non-Jews who would tell me jokes in which Jews were the butt of the joke, were now telling me those same jokes flipped and Arabs were the butt of the joke. And that was all because of the Six-Day War. And we thought this was a permanent change. And our children grew up in this comfortable, accepted environment. But there was something at work under the surface. And that's what I write about in my book. So if Nazism discredited by its visual excesses, I would say,
they went a little too far in how much they hated the Jews. We didn't mean ovens. We just meant a pogrom here and there.
Right. So you couldn't have that genteel anti-Semitism of the British upper classes anymore. It was also discredited. Ironically, until 67, 73, and then Zionism was racism. It needed a new trigger. It needed a new sanitizing seal of approval. What was that seal of approval? Well, if the racist Zionists in Israel were oppressing the Palestinian Arabs, then they were behaving to the new certified minority like the Jews had in the medieval times had behaved to Christians when they stole those Christian children, took their blood for Jewish religious ceremonies. The classic blood libel got reanimated through the libel of Israeli genocide, ethnic cleansing, displacement, all these false accusations against Israel on behalf of the Palestinians. So, and in my book, I just draw a very simple straight line from little St. Hugh of Lincoln, who was purportedly the boy who disappeared in about 11th century England and is the subject of the Prioress's Tale in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, little St. Hugh becomes Mohammed al-Dura. And suddenly the whole world can see Mohammed al-Dura on videos that Al-Qaeda put out to justify or celebrate 9/11, the beheading of Daniel Pearl, and in there is imagery of Mohammed al-Dura. And so,
for those of you who don't remember, Mohammed al-Dura is the boy that Israel was accused of killing. He's hiding behind a cement block with his father, and there's all these pictures. Richard Landes and others put out a lot about this. And the whole thing was doctored and twisted, and he wasn't killed by Israeli soldiers, but that really became the new blood libel. Israel is killing children, and the Palestinian Authority ran with this and made films about him like an angel, and a whole generation was raised on the fact that, like you're saying, Israel, kills little children, and that's the new blood libel.
And so today you see how is it used? It seems almost fantastical that in 2019 this thing still reverberates, but it does, and you can see it in Palestinian propaganda, but you can see it on American college campuses. Posters, I think one at San Francisco State University, notably, where there was an anti-Jewish riot against a little pro-Israel campus program. This was back in 2004, I believe. And all these years later hasn't changed, and so the Jewish students and some others are suing the administration at San Francisco State University for, under American civil rights law, creating a hostile environment.
Well, in the last 15 years, things have only gotten much worse. I mean, the whole liberalism, the whole campus, the intersectionality, the Democratic Party now. I mean, in 2000, and this is something that's being discussed, obviously, here in APAC, like what has gone, but I want my listeners to hear a little bit about your background, and because you didn't write this book 40 years ago, you wrote different books, but what's like brought you, because now you're even retired, but what brought you to this, putting together all these dots and coming to write this book?
So my background is journalism, and I started back in the 70s as a newspaper reporter for the Columbus Citizen Journal in Ohio, Scripps Howard newspaper. And about a decade later, I came to Washington as a press secretary for Congressman Bob Szymanski, newly elected congressman from Columbus, and a Jewish member. And Bob was assigned right off the bat to the Foreign Affairs Committee, Europe and the Middle East Subcommittee. And I suddenly was getting this postgraduate informal education in U.S.-Israel relations, the Middle East, and it became not just one of my interests, but it became my central interest.
What was your personal background?
I grew up in the only Jewish family in Napoleon, Ohio, about 40 miles outside of Toledo. And then we moved to a bigger Jewish metropolis, Tiffin, Ohio, where there were about 6 Jewish families out of about 20,000 people. And so I grew up in a pretty much non-Jewish environment in my daily life, and an understanding, I think, in a way that Jews who grew up in big urban areas in Jewish communities didn't. I understood middle American attitudes, Christian attitudes toward Jews and toward their own religion, and I never felt, in Napoleon, where we were the only Jewish family, my father was elected to school board. My mother used to joke, well, it can't have been the Jewish vote. So we grew up feeling accepted, and as part of a place where religion, whatever it was pretty much private matter. Didn't matter a lot in society, in politics. And the only thing that happened after 1967 was it got better for American Jews. And in my career, then I went to work for AIPAC in the 80s. I edited Near East Report, and I was editor of B'nai B'rith's International Jewish Monthly Magazine, and then at Camera for 14 years, semi-retiring. Okay. Along the way, I realized American Jewish explanations, including PhDs in Holocaust studies, explanations of anti-Semitism, were lacking. Okay, inflation becomes hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s and in the early 30s, and the Germans turn around and elect the Nazis and start throwing Jews in gas chambers. No. Way too simple. I didn't know, and I heard this more sophisticated variations on this theme more than once. And I had the idea, when I was editor of the Jewish Week in the 90s, somebody needs to look into this and spell out why anti-Semitism abides, can take so many contradictory forms, and always remains focused obsessively on what the Jews are not, what anti-Semitism says the Jews are, but the Jews aren't. After 9/11, and especially during and after the Second Intifada, and I began to see the drift in American culture, academia, and the press in particular, and the entertainment world also, places where there are a lot of Jews, mostly a lot of Jews, many of whom don't know much about Judaism or Zionism or Israel. I began to see that the trend was headed in the wrong direction. And then working for Camera, we were battling every day against this trend in the media and on campus. And I just felt compelled to sort out in my own mind and then put on paper for others why the era of never again was coming to an end. And we were moving into, and not so much because of the neo-Nazi far right, but because of the what I call reactionary progressive left, into not an era of never again, but an era of, again, well, it's just another minority problem.
So what we're seeing now, which is anti-Semitism on the far left, didn't surprise you. I know the fact that there's neo-Nazis and then on the far right and the fascists, you're going to have that. Okay. But what seems to have caught a lot of people unawares is what we're having now. And some of the worst anti-Semitism is coming from the far left, from the so-called liberals. Of course, as you said, some of them born to Jewish mothers themselves, and considering themselves Jewish. But from what you're saying here now, for you, this was the inevitable outcome of this process?
1988 at AIPAC, some of us staff members, there was a division at among the Democrats at the Democratic National Convention, and then at AIPAC as well. Should James Zogby, the head of the National American Arab American Association and the Arab American Institute, should he be allowed to speak at the Democratic National Convention? Not so much allowed, but when should he be slotted? Well, it turned out that Zogby was allowed to speak not in the afternoon, not on prime time, not on nationwide TV. And at AIPAC, some of us had this argument, staffers. This was not a board member sort of thing. What did this mean about the Democratic Party? Because the party was, of course, a bit less enamored of supporting the military. It was more focused on domestic issues. It was considered itself an umbrella of different minorities. And some of us, I wasn't the only one, but we were in a minority, argued that if the party kept going this way, now this was 30 years ago, that there's no logical stopping point from the Jews, American Jewry, no matter how active in the Democratic Party and how supportive of the Democratic Party. It will be harder for the Jews to claim their place in the party as a minority, to be part of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, we're going to find out that we're not one of the colors of that rainbow because we'd made it, quote unquote. Jews were basically successful. Jews were basically accepted. So even though we were really or technically a minority, we were part of the majority.
You're part of the rich white man's club.
Right. It wasn't expressed that way then, but it's plain as day now. And a number of writers, is hardly original with me, a number of writers, especially with the new openly anti-Israel members of Congress, have come to the same conclusion. So in the progressive movement in the United States, and certainly in England, obviously you see it in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, Jews are part of the white, privileged power structure, part of the problem. So we can't claim minority status and to keep talking about the Holocaust and the threats to Israel as dangers to Jews as an oppressed minority. It doesn't ring at all for true to people who, A, weren't taught history in any reliable sense in the universities, and the history they learned was kind of inverted history, the kind that made the Palestinians the aggrieved party who never were culpable for any problem. So that trend was underway 30 years ago. I remember speaking to a Hillel at a major American university, also in 1988, and one of the students very earnestly asked me, but shouldn't Israel give the Palestinians a state so they can be like the Israelis? And so I did a quick tour around the Middle East of the Arab countries, and I said, which one of these countries is like Israel? Now, why do you think that if the Israelis had it in their power to actually construct a Palestinian state, it would be any different than those? And by the way, if the Palestinians, who are largely Sunni Arabs, ethnically related to the Syrians, Jordanians, Lebanese, Saudis, and Egyptians, and speak the same language and have the same religion, if they have all those commonalities, then why isn't there a state for Russian Jews? And why isn't there a state for Yemeni Jews? And if we have all our divisions, so why isn't Jordan on a majority of land that was meant for Palestine, with a majority of people who are Palestinian Arabs? So maybe you're talking about a three-state solution. I said, why is that? Why are we even bothering with this? That was my answer, and it was like a light bulb had gone off. Not because I'd said anything brilliant, but simply because they'd never heard it before. Well, you have a whole generation later of people who not only have never heard it, they've heard the opposite, and they become inflamed when you try to tell them the opposite.
So it would be great if your book could make it into some kind of curriculum on a college campus, but I don't see that happening because they don't want to open it up to questions. They don't want people actually thinking there is one way, there is an echo chamber, the safe places. It is so the antithesis of what education is supposed to be that it's really frightening. It's not humorous at all.
So, yes, I'd love to see. I teach, as a matter of fact, I teach part-time at a local community college when they need me. I teach history. Introduction to American History, Western Civ 2, Europe since 1500. Those are introductory courses, and so we just zoomed through them, not spending too much time on Jewish issues, but we do talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, Zionism, Israel. But my book will, the day it gets into university curriculum today, it will get there via promotion by Hillel, by Jewish students, Jewish parents, by non-Jewish pro-Israel students and parents. It'll get there about at the third or fourth stage of a chain process. Yeah.
So are you still, I mean, you live in Fairfax, right? You live right around the D.C. area. Are you still involved with, I know you're semi-retired, but you have many, many connections in the American government from all your years, both as a journalist and as somebody who's been involved with different congressmen. Are you seeing a different DC today under this administration than you had? You know, everyone talks about that, the difference between Obama and Trump. I just have to throw this because we've been talking about Satan. I took a taxi cab ride yesterday, to get to the Museum of the Bible. We were having our function, and the entire time the driver was talking about how this president is Satan, and that's the word that he used. And he backed it up with some quote from Timothy, and he said, we're living in these times, and this man is just evil incarnate, and I said, why? He separated those kids down in Mexico from their families, and there's like no black and white here. I'm not trying to be facetious in terms of Obama and Trump. It's all black and white right now in America. There's no shades of gray, and there's no listening to anybody else. That is a very quick transition in Washington, D.C., from administration to administration. But are you seeing that it's just the White House, or it's, that D.C. is still pretty much the same? How are you analyzing? Because you are an analyst. In addition to being a journalist, what you did for camera was very much analysis. So what's your analysis of what's happening here now?
There's a big difference. It really began under Obama, but that's almost a coincidence of timing. This polarization and the everything's black and white, the stark dichotomies, the either or, and so the inability of people to find common ground or discuss things rationally, we can thank social media and the internet and the fact that everyone can now live in their own echo chamber and simply communicate with it, be reinforced by the other people from their echo chamber without ever leaving the sofa in their mother's basement or getting out of their pajamas, and even for people who are very active and who are always looking at their phone, and they're looking at their next text message, their tweet, their Facebook, whatever their Instagram, whatever. They're fast, and Google does open up the libraries of the world to anybody who wants to actually to delve into it. But social media and the speed of it, and I talk about this briefly in the book, why it's so hard to make Israel's case anymore, especially to younger people who have been raised on social media, is because it's all attention deficit syndrome. Not only is it because people don't learn the same social skills, including civility and courtesy, they instantly become angry when you challenge them. And that's why I write about the secular fundamentalists, the people who are not part of any organized religion. Sometimes can be the most intolerant, as if they'd spent their whole life in a monastery somewhere closed up, listening to the same thing day in and day out. And in fact, thanks to social media, that's how their minds have been conditioned. So that's the difference. That is a huge difference in Washington, and it's just become, and of course President Trump spends a lot of time on Twitter, but it's become, that's a coincidence of timing almost. It was clear under Obama that I have friends who have advanced degrees who tell me they not only don't read books anymore, they can't read books anymore because they can't concentrate long enough. They can still read magazine articles and newspaper articles, but mostly they're on their screen.
What, like our brains have become rewired to just do sound bites and nobody has any concentration for anything? It occurs to me as you're saying this, that, because it always comes back to me to Tanakh, is that is something that you actually do still find in the Jewish world, is that you have to read the text. And like what I love about Shabbat, and I know I'm throwing Shabbat in completely like incongruous to this conversation, that 25 hours of you're going to open up a book, because I don't open up my phone, is what's, I think, saves me. But what you're saying here is like that within a decade, humanity has become, or at least Western civilization. I just did something that I dislike when other people do, and assume that the entire world is like, and humanity is like Western civilization. So we're talking about the United States and Europe, and like I said, Western civilization, which is not so civilized. Come to think of it, has like, there's an illness here. If you can't get the information across in 144 or whatever it is, a tweet, and units, or in 90 characters, or in 90 seconds, and people are going to move on. And truth and facts don't come that quickly. And you talk about the cell phone. We have, assuming that everybody listening has access to a cell phone, you have access to pretty much all the information that you could ever want. You just have to type in who did what, when, and it's all there. And people don't use it for that. They use it for the opposite, for junk.
But if you don't read the texts, and you don't study in what I'm not the only one, I'm repeating what I've learned. If you don't study in deep reading, which is essentially a solitary activity, not connectivity, you don't build the framework in which to put that information you can find online. So a person who's not a reader of texts in the fields in which they're interested in or the subject matters that they're interested in, they can still gather up all that information that's quote unquote out there at your fingertips, but they're not going to be able to assemble it coherently in a way that is both empirical and objectively provable or disprovable, refutable. If you don't mind, Eve, I want to go back to one thing, one of the main themes of the book at this point. So, and this is a good segue in that a person could, if they wanted to, go online and type in Haj Amin al-Husseini and find the man's whole career, right?
The Mufti of Palestine, the big Nazi of Jerusalem, the big Nazi sympathizer, big buddy of Hitler, who was the cause of a lot of deaths on both sides.
And so that's there. It's available. And even the citations to the biographies and the books that have been done connecting the Nazi promotion of anti-imperialism, quote unquote, and Nazi promotion of what became Islamism. But if you don't know the framework, if you have not read and studied, at least read quietly and held the text in your hands, because reading text, printed matter, tactically, holding onto something and looking at it, the printed matter, some psychologists tell you this reinforces the eye to brain connection, and it's why you might actually remember something. Of course, now we've off-sourced memory. Mr. Google has all our memory. So that just makes it, making Israel's case, which is a well-documented case, making the Jewish people's case, which is libraries of texts. You can't begin to do it if you're dealing with people who don't have a framework in which text at least hold the rest of the material. So in my book, I talk about how Palestinian terrorism, the PLO terrorism of the 70s, became, by example, and then multiplied, the gateway drug of Islamist terrorism, Al-Qaeda and all ISIS and all the spin-offs, and worldwide, and especially in the greater Middle East, where by the hundreds of thousands, Muslims kill other Muslims. But yet we must worry about Islamophobia. That's what we're told constantly. It's not that there isn't such a thing, but in terms of proportion, that doesn't seem to be the fundamental cause of the upheavals in the Middle East or the terrorism outside the Middle East. So Palestinian terrorism is the gateway drug to jihadi terrorism. One, the Mufti, and not only the Mufti, there were many others who were based in Berlin during World War II, subsidized both first by Mussolini and fascist Italy, and then by Hitler and the Nazis, and made countless shortwave broadcasts to the Middle East during the war. And the Mufti's genius was to replace the Aryans, Hitler's Aryan race, who was endangered by the Jewish conspiracy, this international Jewish conspiracy right out of the protocols, but with a racial base now instead of a religious base. The Muftis, in one way, just simply extracted the Aryans, the Germans, the Teutonic peoples, and put in Muslims. And why today, to this day, is the cry from Mahmoud Abbas, let alone Hamas, that Al-Aqsa is in danger. Then you get the stabbing intifada. From the 20s on, the Mufti, who lived a long life, dying in Beirut, I think in the 70s, with him it was always, Al-Aqsa is in danger. The Jews are threatening Al-Aqsa. And he made anti-Zionism not only a political thing for Palestinians, Syrian, Jordanian Arabs, He made it a pan-Islamic function. And the use that could be put to was picked up in the 20s by Hassan al-Banna, a big fan of the Muftis, who founded the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Al-Qaeda and ISIS are remote, not even remote, but spin-offs, and Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Brotherhood. And one of the Mufti's listeners, shortwave listeners in Iran during World War II, was a fellow who became known to the world as Ayatollah Khomeini. So the fascist roots, the Nazi roots of Palestinian Arab fundamentalism, hostility to Jews, not just to Israel, is deep, and it comes right out of the same source. And to tell people that the same source of Jews make the best demons.
So people think this is a territorial issue or a political issue, and at its core, and we've been saying this for a long time, it is a religious issue. And it just morphs according to whichever leader can make it work for him in whatever way he can work for him.
Yes, exactly. And one of the points I wanted to draw out in my book was it works for what the people that I call secular fundamentalists, for whom their extreme left ideology is their religion.
I like that term, secular fundamentalists, who are totally messianic.
And so, to come back to what you find today on American college campuses and the blood libel, so at San Francisco State and elsewhere, you've seen these, or we have seen, posters, color posters, and it looks like a can. If, at first glance, it's like a can in a supermarket. But if you look at it a little, slightly more closely, the label is canned Palestinian baby meat under Orthodox supervision, funded by the United States. There you are.
Wow, that is really straight out of Nazi Germany. And it's happening here in America. This has been a very interesting week here because AIPAC is kind of turning itself a little bit in knots. I mean, you have the head of AIPAC, Howard Koros, and Mort Friedman, who've come out for a two-state solution, and a lot of Democrats here. On the other hand, the Democratic Party not only and members of the Democratic Party have not only made anti-Semitic statements, but they actually, what's her name? I hate even using her name.
Ilhan Omar.
Ilhan Omar. There's like a Freudian thing here that I don't want to remember her name. She pretty much said flat out that AIPAC bribes the American government in order to support Israel. And even though AIPAC is number 100 on the list of lobbying, real estate lobbyers gave more money. The whole thing is such a lie.
Someday American Jews will be as powerful as the United Dairy Farmers.
Yeah. No, really. And so this is where I'm seeing AIPAC this week is a little bit stuck because they're not so happy about what's happening here. They're also not so happy about what's happening in Israel. Here we are 2 weeks before the Israeli election, right? So that's why also as we speak, Bibi Netanyahu left and as this is going to be aired. So guys, I'm taping this on March 25th. I don't know what's going to be happening in Gaza. I don't know what's happening during the rest of the week. Netanyahu had to run back. This is all falling into the 2 weeks before the elections. It's really crazy. And I do have to say, though, Hodul Hashem, thanks to God, the rocket that fell on that house yesterday in Israel, that nobody was killed and their 4 dogs were killed, but that the people walked out of that house is an absolute miracle. You know, we've gotten used to the Iron Dome, which is also not a good thing, that we've gotten used to just rockets getting shot out of the sky. But even when they hit, and as horrible as it was, that you didn't have 7 dead people in that house is a flat out miracle. So, you know, just to wrap this up and talk about the demon issue, I think what was identified for so long as Satan, by, you know, what is it that that keeps the Jews going, even when it doesn't seem like they have any right to? It must be some devil or some Satan. Maybe it's actually the love of God. It's the opposite of a Satan or a devil. It's that God has a job for us to do in this world, and even though we're going to take hits, he's going to still be protecting us because we're his people, and he put us here with something to do. So I'm not saying that God is Satan, quite the opposite, and I want to be really, really careful about that. And Judaism really doesn't do the Satan thing, at least at its core it doesn't. But when you're looking at, and I've talked about this before, my listeners have heard me say this before, if you can hold 2 extremes at the same time, So I've been in situations in Israel where the extreme grief and the extreme joy are sitting with me at the exact same time. And maybe this is the exact opposite. What was seen as an evil force is actually a good protective force. But it's hard to explain that.
The conclusion of my book, I think it might be the very last page, is that I cite the historian Barbara Tuchman, who wrote Guns of August and A Distant Mirror. One of her first books in the late 50s was something like from Balfour to Israel. And she was tracing the English connection to the rebirth of a Jewish state. And she finished that book, which is, I don't think, very widely read anymore, with an observation that whether you were religious, Jewish or not, religious or not, the history of the Jews, it's difficult to explain the history of the Jews without reference to some much larger historical mission. And she left it at that. Well, what keeps the Jews going? People that are in touch with their Judaism, Jews who are in touch with their Judaism in any way. Dennis Prager used to say he didn't care whether you were Reform, conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, as long as you were a serious Jew. Any serious Jew has to reflect that, yes, we have a positive historical mission.
I believe some kind of divine protection to some degree, and certainly there's been times where he wasn't around as much as I would have liked him to be in order to accomplish that. So, but that gets twisted by people who don't understand or are jealous or a gazillion reasons, which would take another 100 hours to discuss, and anti-Semitism and Robert Wistrich's amazing book, which I think is the classic fundamental book on trying to explain the inexplicable on anti-Semitism. So I want to thank you, Eric, so much. Jews Make the Best Demons, Palestine and the Jewish Question by Eric Rozenman. I think even if you know a lot about what's happening here, the book puts it together in a really important way to make sense of it, flows beautifully, and definitely for all of you who care about what's happening here, not just about Israel and the Jewish people, but about a lot of things going on in the world right now, definitely a worthwhile read. Where can they get the book?
Barnes & Noble online, Amazon online, and you can go to my publisher, also newenglishrevewpress.org.
Thank you so much, Eric Rozenman, for joining me here today and for the cup of coffee especially. Okay, everybody, I'm heading back into APAC. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. And thanks to Ben and to Tabitha, you guys can always write to me, eve@thelandofisrael.com. You can always check out my website, eveharrow.com. And always happy to hear from you. I've run into some people here at APAC. Somebody just came and tapped me on the shoulder and said, I recognized your voice. I listened to your podcast and I just wanted to come up and say hi, which was really, really great. And I love that. So be in touch and take care, everybody. Be well and goodbye for now.
Tune in for an exclusive interview with Yitzhak Hendricks, former mayor of Beitar Illit and former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, now a candidate for Knesset with United Torah Judaism.
The Green Line was there 50 years ago. The Green Line is maybe a nice piece of paper in the UN, but it doesn't really mean anything for a regular Israeli. Today, it's about 15% of the Israeli Jewish population, at least, live over the Green Line.
For the full interview, listen to Inside Israel Today with Gil Hoffman on the Land of